Is identity politics one of the primary afflictions of our cultural moment? Well, Joshua Mitchell definitely thinks so, but what did I think about his argument? Well, let's take a look. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. All right, I have here a copy of American Awakening, which came out in 2020 by Joshua Mitchell, who is an academic and a political philosopher that I wasn't familiar with, but thanks to a viewer of this channel who recommended it, I discovered him and this book. So thank you, you know who you are, who recommended this. But I want to talk a little bit about this in my format, which is main idea, research, readability, and reasonableness. So let's get into it. The main idea of American Awakening is actually a little different than what I expected when I went into it. So I expected, it obviously is alluding to the religious awakenings in American history, and I thought it might be an exploration of what's happening with so-called wokeness and identity politics and all of the social justice movement. I thought it would be an exploration, more of an historical exploration of how that has emerged, like one of the great awakenings in kind of American religious history. That's what I thought the book was going to be, but it's actually really not that. It's much more of a straight philosophical, theological, cultural exploration of things that are happening right now. So it's less of an historical perspective, not an historical argument or an historical case. It's more of a just a philosophical case of what's happening right now and exploring, in his view, what's unhealthy about it. So that being said, the main idea is there's a few really core ideas to the book. The biggest one that takes up the most page length actually is about identity politics, and Mitchell contrasts what he calls a politics of liberal competence versus a politics of identity. So he's really making the case to try to restore. It's in some senses it's a defense of a classical liberal view of human society, which is to say that he wants to defend the idea of liberal competence, meaning that we need to focus on building skills and a competency in our citizens to contribute to a liberal project, as opposed to focusing on identity as a way of kind of as a proxy measure for who can and who shouldn't have a voice. We shouldn't focus on identity, we should focus on competence. So that's the main argument and exploration of the book, takes up the majority of the book. But he also fascinatingly examines two other afflictions, as he calls it. One he labels bipolarity, and then the other so bipolarity refers to, he talks about management society versus our individualistic focus, and there's kind of a bipolarity there. And then the third thing he focuses on is addiction, and he looks at addiction through this fascinating lens of a supplement versus substitution, when there's something that's a good supplement that we use as a full substitution. So anyways, he unpacks these three. It's very philosophical, as you can tell, probably by my attempt to summarize it, but he unpacks these three afflictions, as he calls them, and talks about what's going on, what's wrong. He offers suggestions for how we should think about it in a different way, and to do that, he draws on a ton of sources, which gets me into my next point, which is the research behind the book. So he's a political philosopher. He's an academic, I believe, at Georgetown, and he cites a wide variety of sources, and I have to say he is a very, very good reader of some really, really hard sources. So he's a very, very good reader and interpreter of Plato, of Alexis de Tocqueville, of political philosophers like John Rawls or John Locke. He's a really excellent interpreter of Nietzsche, I found. And there's others too. I mean, that's just a smattering. And then also I have to say there's a lot of scripture, Christian scripture specifically cited in this book. And I have to say, so I'm a pastor, I went to seminary, I studied the Bible a lot. I have to say his use of scripture is, well, it's really excellent. I mean, he's not, I almost hesitate to bring this up because I really don't want, if you're not a Christian or if you're not interested in scripture, the Christian Bible specifically, I really don't want you to be turned off of this book, because I think the way he uses scripture is fascinating and very smart, very subtle. It's not shallow, like you would find in a lot of kind of, I don't know, more simplistic Christian writings. I almost hesitate to even identify this as a Christian book because it's so wide-ranging, but he does draw on Christian scriptures quite a bit, alongside all those other philosophers. So the research is very wide. He is a very, very, like I said, smart and good reader of these sources, and he uses them in his writing, I thought, to great effect. So that's a bit about the research behind it. The readability now, which that kind of goes into the next question, is, okay, sounds smart, is it readable? in general, so I personally really liked the style of the book. It's very, it's interesting. Each section is numbered, so there's a long section. The sections are not too long, actually. They're probably, a lot of them range about a half a page, 2 pages. And each section is numbered, and he numbers each section straight through the book, and then eventually he'll refer to back in section so-and-so, I referred to this idea. And so it kind of builds on itself over that, and it's very systematic and logical in that way. It is pretty dense in its style, and he weaves in and out of all those sources I just mentioned. So if you don't have any basic familiarity with a source like Nietzsche, I could see maybe getting a little underwater as you're reading this book, but I also don't think, it's not obtuse, it's not impenetrable. So this is a tough one for me to really quantify. It's really going to depend on your own kind of reading comfort and your reading background and what you are familiar with already. But I have to say, it is on the denser side. It's a lot packed into a short page count, but it is not as hard to read as Nietzsche or Plato or any of those sources I just mentioned. It's definitely not as hard to read as that. So I'm sorry if that's a squishy definition on the readability. It's really hard to peg this one down. But if you are interested in those sources I just mentioned, if you are familiar in broad strokes, if you're familiar with even what identity politics already refers to and what it already means, then I think you're going to love the way he unpacks it. It may not be the first book I recommend because of some of those things I just mentioned, but I think if you're already a little bit versed in some of those subjects, as I think probably a lot of people who watch my book reviews are, I think you're going to love this book. And that's finally what I went in on, is Reasonableness. I really love this book, actually. I really liked it. I've held back my opinion, I think, so far, but I am really impressed with it. In some ways, it's a classically conservative take, in the sense that he does try to wave a cautionary flag and say that we should have a more careful, thoughtful view of what he calls our inheritance, our cultural and social inheritance that we've gotten from previous generations. And that's kind of classic de facto conservative political theory, is be slow to change, slow to throw out our inheritance, so to speak. And so in that way, it's classically conservative. But and this is really important, it does not fit into our cultural containers of progressive conservative at all. For example, he puts forward 3 major pillars of kind of fixing or reforming our society. And one of his pillars, the second pillar, is real healing and reconciliation from what he calls the wound of slavery. So he puts race right in the center of his project, of what he sees as the most important things that we need to really address well. So it's fascinating because it does not fit into what you'd consider typical progressive or reactionary conservative or reactionary progressive camps at all, because he's extraordinarily critical of identity politics and the ways that he sees that as kind of a toxic effect on what he calls liberal competence. But he also puts race and real racial reconciliation and healing from the wound of slavery, which he argues we haven't actually done yet in our culture. That needs to be right at the center of his project. So that's part of why I love this book. It does not fit into any categories that we have. It's extraordinarily thoughtful. He's a powerful reader and interpreter of these various sources that I mentioned. The ways he unpacks some of his ideas, you might read an idea and like bounce off of it. So for example, when he talked about addiction, I kind of bounced off of it, and bipolarity. The second and third ideas, my initial approach to them was, this seems crazy. Like you're starting to lose me here, Mitchell. But as he unpacks it layer by layer, it starts to really make sense where he's coming from, and you can really see his argument that he's making. One very specific example in the addiction section that plays this out is he talks about drinking bottled water as one. He uses tons of examples of how a supplement becomes a substitute. And he plays this out in our kind of addicted cultural mindset. And when I read that he was going to talk about drinking bottled water, I thought, this is crazy. What am I reading right now in this book of political philosophy? But then by the end of that section, he convinced me, as crazy as it sounds, he convinced me that drinking bottled water is a sign of our addictive cultural kind of malaise. So it's a very compelling book. I can't say I agree with everything in it, but I would say that about almost no book, right? They're all complicated, nuanced takes on culture. And Joshua Mitchell's is right in there with the best of them, but I think it's extremely well written, it's extremely well researched. Maybe a little, your mileage may vary on the readability piece, but I highly recommend American Awakening if you want a precisely argued look at what's going on in our culture right now. And I just want to say one more thing about it, because my last review that I did was for John McWhorter's book, Woke Racism. And one of my critiques of McWhorter's book was that I don't think he was a good reader of religion or religious history, and he didn't bring religious concepts to bear in some of his critiques of wokeness, so to speak. And thankfully, Joshua Mitchell fills that void. This book does exactly what I wish McWhorter's book did in that specific way, is he brings a really keen, perceptive eye on religious history and religious concepts and theological ideas that need to be brought to bear into something like identity politics today, and he does it to great effect. So, wonderful book, one I'm definitely going to be keeping on my shelf, one that I'll be referring to as time goes by, because I think there's so much packed into there, it's so insightful, and I would heartily endorse and recommend Joshua Mitchell's American Awakening. Thanks as always for watching. I hope that you found something thought-provoking, intellectually stimulating here, maybe even found a book that you'll fall in love with.